this series is called Hamster Church. We try and do this once a month. It hasn't always worked out during COVID. And essentially, we typically invite someone from the Bellingham area, which is where we're located, to join us for a conversation about who they are, what they're doing. And the intent is to try to de-other others. The more you have personal connection with people who have different ideas, who have a different culture, who have different anything, the more we are able to see that everyone is human and that we can build connections and we can actually just be better neighbors. So kind of the famous Mr. Rogers line, won't you be my neighbor? So that's a lot of what Hamster Church, which is this series, this discussion series, is trying to do, because we actually see it as a very spiritual exercise to try to get to know one another's neighbors. It is in my opinion, it is a God-ordained thing. And Jodi, you up for starting?
Good to go.
Okay. Jodi is a good friend of mine. As I mentioned earlier, I am one of the collaborative pastors of Echoes Bellingham, a Lutheran funky mission development here in Bellingham, Washington. And Jodi and I went to seminary together. So the admissions person connected me with Jodi. Jodi got voted in as the one who was going to be my introduction to this seminary, and it ended up being a friendship, which I've been super grateful for. So Jodi is incredibly bright and has had a lot of experience within a church context and First Nations cultures and peoples, particularly in British Columbia, where she resides. And she's going to be able to offer us some words. Oh, this is my cat, by the way. It's Daisy. And Daisy. So she's going to be able to offer us some words tonight about some of her experiences with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and her work within churches and starting a church up in Vancouver as well. I will say that we are on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Lummi and Nooksack tribes here, and the Samish and the Semiahmoo as well. So Jodi, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. And let me say, I'm also on Coast Salish territory. This is the land of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. But there are some language similarities along the coast, which is kind of a fun reality and reminds us that these borders are fictions that haven't always existed in these ways. So in some ways, maybe we are still neighbors in a bigger way. I, as Sherris has said, am currently residing north of the 49th parallel, and have done so for a little over 20 years. It's fun to see various of you on here who have also lived north of the border, or maybe still are currently here in this region. And I am a settler. That's a new term to you. I'm happy to talk about that later, but my family came from Finland and from Germany and settled in the traditional territories of the Lakota and the Cheyenne nations stateside. And then I, as I said, came to Vancouver for Regent College and stayed, but also had the experience of asking permission and being granted permission to stay in this territory by the peoples whose land this is. In this part of the world, we call land that has not been given in treaty or by any sort of agreement. We call that unceded territories. That might be new terminology to some folks. So it's particularly important that where there haven't been agreements about sharing the land, that for me, it's been significant to be granted permission.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
How did that permission get granted? Do you have like a particular group you're supposed to ask, or who has the ability to grant that? What's the story around that?
Yeah, for me, it came as a part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, which we'll talk about in a little bit. but that raised an awareness that of something I hadn't known was a need, but then a practice that I've continued even when I'm traveling or backpacking or those sorts of things, to ask the permission of the peoples whose land I'm going to be traveling on. And that has been an amazing opportunity for conversation and relationships to develop. In this case, at the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings in Vancouver, a number of us came in by sea in canoes and came into the harbor and asked permission to come ashore, and to stated our intentions of how and why we wanted to be in this territory, which was all a very magical sort of way to go about that. You can also just show up at a local band office and bring a gift and ask permission.
Wow, okay, that's interesting. Okay, but I interrupted your story. You can keep going.
I'm happy to be interrupted.
Okay.
But yeah, we'll call that good for an introduction for now. You'll ask me more questions.
Okay, perfect. Jodi has been a pastor in the Vancouver area, and has at one time started a church that was for First Nations folks, and that's a very interesting venture, which maybe we'll talk about in a little bit. And Jodi currently does a lot of work with churches, bringing a kind of language around how you be the church in the midst of the reality that the church has been so unbelievably damaging to a very large group of people. And so her work is I don't know if liaison is the right word, but one who brings different ways of thinking and possibilities of change as well. So Jodi's done a lot of that in the last number of years, including a lot of other things, but that's primarily what we're focusing on tonight. And a lot of folks, including myself, south of the border, we did not have a chance to participate in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, and word about it down here wasn't that great. So would you be able to kind of give us an overview of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that happened over a several-year span up in Canada?
Yeah, so historically there are about 33 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have happened around the world, and ours came at the initiative of those who survived Indian residential schools here in Canada. There's some slight differences in the history of the US and Canada around this, but in Canada it was mandated for a little over 100 years that all Indigenous children were to be removed from their families and educated in state-sanctioned, church-run schools across the country. And so those who went through those schools, survivors of the schools, took churches and government to court to name that as a violation of their human rights. And they won the largest class action lawsuit in history, which resulted in then them winning meant that they could have just taken the money allotted them and run, but instead they asked for a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the intention of which was to tell the stories of what had happened through this legacy across the country and in this shared reality for non-Indigenous folks who largely had no idea that this was going on. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission lasted for 5 years and happened in a variety of cities and communities across the country where survivors were able to tell their stories of what their residential school experience was like. Also RCMP officers who were, for example, responsible for taking children who had run away and bringing them back to schools could tell their stories. Teachers could tell their stories. And this process of wanting a healing that would happen in the nation as a result of the sharing of these stories was something that those residential school survivors who are now elders felt was necessary to change the course of the conversation for subsequent generations. And so they endured the pain and hardship of telling some very difficult stories. Many of them told stories that they had not ever told even to family members. They had never been shared until the commission hearings. But they took that upon themselves as a way of opening a door for healing and right relationship with all Canadians, which is a pretty profound act.
Yeah. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission then was a result of the victory of a court
case. Yeah.
It itself was not a legal proceeding. It itself was the opportunity for the retelling of, or the tellings for the first time of these stories.
Mm-hmm.
And how did you get involved, and kind of what was your role in this?
Yeah. So as the commission was beginning, I was just beginning the church plant that Sheriff mentioned, God's House of Many Faces, which we didn't intend to be a First Nations church, but as we responded to the invitation of some folks, those who came were largely First Nations. And so that was sort of my context. And in my Baptist denomination, then I was the closest thing to someone who had any contact with Indigenous peoples, and was tasked with going to the reconciliation conversations that had been started by some elders, Indigenous elders in the community. So some of the folks, the 5 who started the class action lawsuit, were all actually from BC, and are amazing. In this case, they are all men, but amazing, amazing men and mentors. And they held this vision most strongly of this being an opportunity of opening up wounds so that they could be healed. And part of that vision, they knew, wasn't necessarily going to be held by this external body, but it needed to happen on the ground, person to person. And so they convened, a couple of them convened a group of religious leaders and residential school survivors here in BC. And we met together once a month for between 3 and 5 hours for 3.5 years. And that process was one of just trying to say together, what even are we talking about in this journey of reconciliation? How do we speak to each other and hear one another? Minimizing the harm we do to one another, but recognizing that even our ways of being together weren't necessarily good for the thriving of those Indigenous elders. And so trying to learn in this process what all the dynamics were that were going on, and trying to respond to those in good ways. And so that was a profound experience to just be with those folks. And really what we were doing was preparing for the Vancouver Truth and Reconciliation event, which was one of 7 national events that happened across the country, but one that had greater engagement of non-Indigenous participants as well, which was very much a part of the vision of those elders.
What was it like for you being in those 3 to 5 hour meetings once a month? So you say it was profound. Can you add a little bit more language around that?
Yeah, super uncomfortable. That would be one. bit of language, right? Where you think you know, you think you know things, and you find out you don't know things, right? Which is hard to show up over and over again to know that you're going to find out how little you know. I went in particularly, I was the pastor of a mostly First Nations church. I am an immigrant from the US. I wasn't here when all of these things happened. I was coming as a bridge builder. I was coming to make peace, which is part of all of the crappy white myths that we live in and that needed to get taken apart and undone so that we could love one another, right, in our true humanity. And then one of the elders, Chief Bobby Joseph, pulled me aside at one point in time and he said, "Jodi, you see yourself as separate." And I thought, finally, someone understands. Someone recognizes my unique role. He said, but it was people who look like you, who love Jesus like you, who talk like you, who came into our communities and did tremendous harm. And if there aren't people who look like you and talk like you and love Jesus like you, who can name and own those harms, then there's no opportunity for healing. With whom can we be reconciled if there's no one who says, it was me? Mm. And so really, those years were a painful process of learning how to walk into that space and to say, it was me, it is me. I continue to do that harm. And that is the only way actually that we can start to see healing come. Healing in myself and healing in our relationship. But the healing in myself, is not why we do this, but it is a profound byproduct when we do it well.
Wow. Okay. And those gatherings that went on for 3.5 years had to happen in order for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission engagement, one of the 7 events, that had to happen before those could happen. Is that?
It really did. In order for those events to happen in ways that had enough purchase in our communities and in our lives to maybe be the toe or the shoulder that got thrown into the door as it was slamming closed, to be able to keep that open, to change dynamics again for coming generations. So we can have profound experiences that we are confronted with our racism. We could be confronted with atrocities. We can be very empathetic and compassionate about those things, but to actually move that to action that undoes, that decolonizes our lives and begins to create new realities, begins to challenge systemic ways that those patterns of harm are entrenched in the status quo. Those are harder and longer processes, but the teachings I've received from those elders has been that those have to happen out of relationship, and they have to happen out of honest relationship that is willing to call one another out, but mostly to call out whiteness and the damaging impacts of racism in the ways that it disproportionately impacts persons of color.
So it takes 3.5 years of, first a court case is won, and then money is earmarked for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to be formed and to have the events across Canada. It takes 3.5 years at least in Vancouver. Because were these types of meetings happening across Canada for the 7 different locations? They were?
They were. So gatherings like ours were not happening between survivors and church leaders, for example. Those largely started to happen as word of the impact of the Vancouver conversations started to take place. But Vancouver is where that happened most intentionally, again, under the leadership of those 5 folks who had initially brought the court case.
Yeah. So then the commission is, and what was the event called in Vancouver? Did it have a name other than the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Vancouver location?
I don't think it did.
Okay, all right. I just need to know if I needed a different word in there.
Yeah, no.
What did it look like? So folks were having the opportunity to tell their story. What type of venue? What was the structure in which this storytelling happened?
Yeah, and there's some pieces around the Vancouver event that were unique as well, that were part of the design of Vancouver, that are unique too. So one was that we began the whole thing, as I told that story of coming in by canoe, we began the whole thing with those who were coming from away to be part of this, coming in by canoe and asking permission to be there and to participate in these hearings in a good way, and to state our intentions of how and why we wanted to be on the land together. And then the hearings themselves happened at our fairgrounds, which actually is the site of one of the creation myths for the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. There's a river there, but that river's been totally covered over. You can't even see it. But that was an important part of choosing the P&E grounds here in Vancouver. And so there were 3 different ways that people could tell their stories. They could tell it just privately to 1 or 2 people who they invited to come and hear it and have it recorded by video. Or they could speak their story to the 3 commissioners, and they could do that in a public auditorium with hundreds of people listening in. Or they could do it in small circles with maybe 10 survivors in a circle, and maybe 50 to 100 people on the outside of that circle listening in as they just spoke to one another about their stories. So it happened in a variety of ways, and folks could do that however they felt most comfortable. And then there was also like celebrations and concerts and various ways that we came together to feast and to eat and to engage in ceremony together at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day. There's also a sacred fire that was kept throughout the time, and a sunrise ceremony that was really impactful. I had the opportunity to bring some kids whose grandparents had been in the schools to those sacred fires, and for them to offer their prayers in the mornings in that way was really important for them. And then at the end of the hearings, there was also a unique event that was called the Walk for Reconciliation. And the idea of that was we had heard these stories. We had shown up to this moment, and having borne witness to this, we were then invited, everybody was invited to walk in this new way together, to begin our journey together in a new way. And that was a spectacular event. It included folks who on the coast who have traditions of various masks that are usually only used in really significant ceremonies. You're pretty much being there's either a covenant being made between you, or you're being invited into family if you witness someone wearing that mask and doing some of the ceremony that was part of this. There was a scrim created with the Tree of Life by Bo Dick, who's a Kwakwakwa elder and artist who's since passed. And this very powerful symbol of, as we passed under that Tree of Life, we were entering into new life together. And it was a cold and rainy day in September, and tens of thousands of people showed up in the rain and walked in the rain, and some on this call were there, and it was probably one of the most impactful events of my entire life. But the generosity, particularly of the elders who had designed that to make space for every tongue, tribe, and nation. There were also people of all different ethnic traditions who were playing instruments along the way. Dr. Bernice King spoke. Yeah, it was a very powerful event. This woman from Zambia was next to me on the bridge at one point in time, and there were people crossing over on these two bridges, and so at one point they were just both chock-a-block full, and she had her national flag and she's waving that, and she's yelling and she's proclaiming, like, what a beautiful, powerful day this is for unity and for right relationship moving forward. And I'll never forget her in that moment, and her celebration of this is someone who I would have otherwise said, oh, what does that have to do with her? This is about what's happening in Canada, but her ability to see, no, like our liberation is all caught up together with one another.
Wow. So we certainly have, in particular in the last number of years, have had a lot of marches, and the marches that we have had have typically been protests for change, for things. We've got to somehow undo the systemic oppression, particularly of racism, in our nation. And they predominantly are peaceful, but they have a purpose of, we need things to change. And the event that you're describing is something different than that. It sounds like. Do you feel like things changed?
It's a very good question. This is our challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
We show up and we walk, but do we actually walk in new ways? Some things, as with the states right now, right? I was just listening to someone say that in Black Lives Matter marches that are happening, that this person was struck by the fact that there are different people showing up in these marches than the marches she was a part of 40, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Is that change? Will that stick? That's a question for this moment as well. There's not been the change that we hoped for. There continues to need to be, we continue to need to walk in new ways. And every sector of our society has work to do to begin to do that. One of the gifts of the commission was was a final report in which certain subsequent actions were asked for. And so there is a template for some things that need to happen, and it's hard to get those things to happen, but there are folks who are working on that.
So we're going to get to some of the template for sure. Yeah. I still want to tease out a little bit this March and the feeling of this being one of the most profound experiences you've ever had. And I'm hearing that there was a sense of unity and oneness, and maybe the word hope possibly in there. What was this sense? Was it directly related to the telling of the stories? Was that part of it? Or had these elders been able to set the stage for people to actually know and believe that we are one people of many cultures, but still the same humanity? What caused that sense of profundity in the midst of this march for you and for others?
For me, I had the gift of knowing some of the symbols that we were walking into. Not everybody did. And for me, the fact that in light of having just named horrific atrocities that had happened to people, that then those very same people who had been victimized said, "We name you as family."
Okay.
That's the profundity for me, and part of why I do the work that I do now is that realization, the deepening realization that we're family, and that's not something I can leave behind. That's not something I can decide I don't have time for, or was a phase, or whatever. It's not something I can walk away from. But in families, we don't always do that well, but we have different ways of holding each other accountable as family, and the hurt when we don't show up is a different kind of hurt too. And so it's that gift of that relationship that I think was particularly significant for me, and maybe marks a difference from some other things that I've participated in that I think are important for us to show up and put our feet on the ground for. But yeah, there was a substantial shift that happened in our relationship, and that was part of it.
Yeah, and I can see that it would be. To have a sense of welcome in the family, with having had the immediate acknowledgement, the overwhelming cascading flood of acknowledgement of how much damage had been done. And yet those who have been damaged are somehow existing on a plane of the ability to welcome in and want to exist as a family. It is extremely profound. It's extremely profound. So thank you for sharing that, and for being there, and for going through a lot of this hard work. And you have then had the ability to kind of be involved in what those the mandates for change that came down as this is what needs to happen. Can you share some of those with us?
Yeah. So a couple of things were named for churches in particular, faith communities in particular, because again, in our context, it was the church that was the arm of the state to bring so much harm. Which, let me also say that I think part of what was profound about the Walk for Reconciliation was it was like it was like Jesus laying down his life and inviting us into family. And it was Indigenous folks doing that for us again, right? And reminding us of what it is to be church and the ways that we had failed at what is core in our faith context for that. So a couple of things that were asked of faith communities in particular, one of which was to, and I share these because these also would be relevant to those of you in the States as well. So one is the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, which is a really old set of papal bulls from the from point of contact through the 1600s. But basically they lay a theological framework that I experience regularly that keeps cropping up both in our legal systems, and it crops up in our ways of talking about Indigenous people, particularly as people of faith, where what we as non-Indigenous folks are looking for or use as our tools to disqualify Indigenous peoples from their full humanity goes right back to those statements written by those priests in the 14 to 1600s. So learning what that doctrine is and figuring out how we pick up out of our theology, where have we adopted those principles of theology and enshrined them in our ways of operating with Indigenous peoples in this land. So repudiating that and respecting Indigenous spirituality is a second one. And lots of things to be said about that. There is a learning community called NAITS, the Native American Institute of Indigenous Theological Studies. That's a group of folks who've been self-theologizing from an Indigenous perspective in North America for a long time, and are a good place to go and look for some of the work that they have done. Cheryl Bear, who I'd hoped might be available to be on here with me, is one of the board members of NAITS. And self-theologizing, so Indigenous people have been the object of our missionary movements since contact, and I wonder how many Indigenous theologians we all could name on this call. So the ways in which we have not allowed Indigenous people to then take up their voice as theologians and to shape what church looks like for Indigenous peoples, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all some of the pieces that need to be addressed. And then the final one is adopting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So Canada and the US were two of the last countries to adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And neither country has any legislation that gives this document any teeth. This was to be picked up as our framework for reconciliation. And so in the work that I do, this is our key go-to space. What's important about this document is that it was created by Indigenous peoples. It took about 20 years to be created and passed at the UN. And that included 2 hunger fasts on the floor of the UN chambers to say, no, these things, you can't just throw these things out. These are essential for all Indigenous peoples around the world. And so, so for it to be an Indigenous document that is recognized by the UN is really significant. And it has all the language of nation states. And, you know, if you want to fall asleep really fast at night, you could try and read through it cover to cover. But there are some really really profound pieces that are named in here. One of the things that when I take folks through the UN Declaration, one of the things people notice right away is, holy cow, why did these need to be named as like rights for Indigenous people? Are these not just assumed as basic human rights? The reality is they're not assumed for Indigenous peoples to be basic rights. That there has been need to articulate that very specifically. And some of the pieces in here include stuff like the right to family, security of your family. Well, what does that mean and look like? One of the things it means and looks like is what are the apprehension rates for Indigenous children in your communities into foster care? So if those rates are higher than the percentage that group is of the population, then that's an indicator that there's systemic racism at play in that dynamic. So Washington State, I looked this up today, Washington State, 1.5% of the children in Washington State are Indigenous, and 6.6% are in foster care. So that is a considerably higher percentage of overall numbers, and it would be, there are some other ways to break down those numbers that can be helpful. In the states in general, though, Alaska, for example, has 51% of children in foster care are Indigenous. South Dakota, which is where I lived before moving to Canada, is at 50%. So these numbers are important to look at to be able to identify today what are the places where the things that we named were bad in the past. What are the legacies that are continuing on into the present? And so the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a key place for us to begin to lift up and to notice today the ways in which those inequities are entrenched in our systems. And if anybody's interested, I can make available to you, created a prayer resource out of this document, just as a way of starting to say, hey, how do we, as people of faith, how do we get this into our language and into our prayer lives so that it begins reshaping us in significant ways?
Thank you. And how do you, when you go into a church to be someone being called in to offer your experience and help to explore colonialism and racism and the theology that has gotten us where we are, what do you do in a church? What do you do with them? Do you walk through those mandates of the commission? And how do you do that work?
Yeah, we do some of that. And because that's kind of our settler work to do, to catch up on that. And the other piece that's really important is that we listen to local Indigenous voices. So in every context that we're in, we ask the local Indigenous group what they would want to come and say to communities of faith who want to walk this journey in a good way together. And they will often pick up some of the items that are most critical for them in their particular region. And some of the work that I do is then preparing those communities to be good allies to walk under Indigenous leadership towards dismantling some of those dynamics. Can I follow a squirrel for a moment and interact with the chat a bit? So Sharon has asked about the percentage of Indigenous kids in foster care in BC, and Senator provided those numbers. I will just note that we have funny rules, and that these would be true in the States as well, so pay attention to these, where sometimes we stop, in the name of ending racism, we stop identifying things like indigeneity or ethnicity. And usually those movements happen when the numbers are too embarrassing for the state. And so then, well, we don't know, or our numbers improved because we aren't counting who is Indigenous anymore, or we count them by some standard set by the state and not by those communities. So those all become really important questions to be asking about where the numbers come from. That's true for us in Canada around Indigenous folks in prison, especially, that our numbers in prison, especially women in prison, are horrific. In some provinces in the prairies, that's up to 96% of the population in women's prisons are Indigenous, and the government has stopped counting, keeping track of how many are Indigenous or people's ethnic backgrounds, because of how embarrassing it has been for the state that those numbers continue to climb. So important background questions to ask along the journey.
So instead of trying to change the numbers, they just ignore them.
Just change how we count them. Yeah.
Wow. It's not surprising, and it's incredibly demoralizing in that if you're not paying attention to the reality, nothing will change, because it will continue to be it will continue to be the norm, essentially, because nobody looks at the norm. The norm is the norm.
Exactly.
You know? So
exactly.
Wow. Can you tell us a few stories of what it's been like to go into a church? And have you had really positive experiences there? Have you had experiences that were like, oh my gosh, things are never going to change? Can you share a few stories?
Yeah. It's one of the teachings that's important for me from Indigenous elders is that we need to look at generations, and so they're helping me to look for generational impact and not necessarily looking for the impact that happens today, because sometimes that can be pretty discouraging. Which raises this other question of how do we stay at work for a long time, and how do we sustain that work over a long period.
So can I just pause for a second? So I happen to know you're fantastic with kids. So does that mean some of the work that you're doing in churches is with kids? If we're looking at this to be a generation thing, because I do know, I have certainly heard, you know, the phrase to the seventh generation pretty commonly. And so are you working with little ones when you go into church as well?
There's a little bit of work. So a colleague of mine has created some storytelling. If you're familiar with storytelling process called godly play, she's created some godly play stories around colonization. And actually kids are getting better education around this stuff than adults. So the kids they're on board and much more aware of some of these dynamics than the adults. I don't do a lot of work directly with children, but it is, I will say in terms of foster care, that's one that's big on my heart. It's also one where churches tend to be the ones providing a lot of foster care. And for many Indigenous folks here in Canada, they would say that foster care is the new residential school. Foster care or prisons, both of which continue to remove children and adults. Our incarceration rates for juveniles, Indigenous juveniles, is also extremely out of control in terms of being disproportionate to the population. And so encouraging churches to find other ways of providing supports for whole families, rather than continuing this legacy of removing children from families. So there are a couple of churches that we've worked with who had a large number of folks who were providing foster care. It was a very challenging set of conversations to raise that maybe was in line with previous practices of removal of children, and but this group of people had some real courage in being willing to challenge their language and some of their assumptions about the care that they were providing and what was possible. And a number of families have committed to caring for whole families, and to, instead of the children, so providing support for maybe mom and kids, or maybe mom and dad and kids, either within their home or as a community of folks who are interacting together with kids who otherwise are at risk of being taken into the foster care system. And also then giving back the money that normally you would be compensated for being a foster parent. So this is true both in the US and in Canada, that foster parents get more money per child than someone who's on social assistance gets for that same child. And so those inequities don't set up an equal playing field for the kinds of opportunities you can provide to a child. So are we disadvantaging their family of origin, even economically, in that dynamic? So some ways that funds are being redistributed to families and communities, or being turned back to the tribe in some cases, who then are able to provide more resources within that community. So that's been one piece that's been encouraging. Something that's been harder for us to see progress around is equitable transformation, where settler folks are taking the leadership of Indigenous folks. We like to have a project, and we like to be good at it and be able to say, look, this is what we did, instead of being able to say, what can I do to simply show up in these ways? I will say one thing about the redistribution of land, though, that this is one of the foundations of the reason why did we remove children from their homes and their families? Why do we continue to remove children from families and destabilize communities? Because it gives us land. We can say, hey, there's nobody there. And so there are some churches who are starting to, there's a church in Saskatchewan that had purchased land that they were ready to build a new, bigger facility on. And in their learning process, decided that they needed instead to give that land back to the local Indigenous group that was present there. That's huge. Other groups of churches who have started to pay what would be property tax They've paid that into a fund that goes to, so here in the Lower Mainland, that's going to a fund that is held by the local 3 nations whose land we're on. And so they're getting to the place where, because churches are tax exempt, they're trying to pay what would be their tax to the local Indigenous folks for that land and the use thereof. And that's starting to change conversations significantly with those nations as well, as we show up and kind of put our money where our mouth is with no advantage to ourselves in those kinds of efforts. Then the possibilities of partnership that are opening up are really encouraging.
That's good to hear. That is very good to hear. One of the reasons I was, well, the major reason I was very excited to talk with you, because you have, you know so much and you have experience here, and your humility is refreshing. And it kind of, by the time settlers, you know, got over to the West, basically the colonial massacre just, you know, was already happening. And then the colonialists come in and they set up shop, and we have all kinds of treaties that are manufactured to take land, essentially to take land into rights and to sequester folks who moved around a lot according to the seasons and harvests, and to keep them in one small space so that the white settlers could have everything else, essentially. And that is so, like, if you're paying attention, it's so in your face here. In Washington, we can call it the Pacific Northwest. It's not the Northwest in BC. I learned that when I lived there. But the Coast Salish peoples have been here since time immemorial, and we have 2 reservations here in our county, and we live on land that should never have been settled. I know that the Black Lives Matter movement is a movement that needs to continue to gain steam, and it is, and it is an awesome thing that more people are starting to show up, and different people are coming to the marches, as you have said. So I feel like there's a need for us to not lose focus on the fact that we're dealing with racism as a bigger picture, right? And here we are neighbors with those who have been oppressed for, you know, as long as the treaties have been written. And we talked a little bit prior to tonight about how there's intersectionality between racism towards Black folks, and there's racism towards Indigenous folks, and there's overlap, but there's also some particularities there. And I think it might be helpful if you could speak a little bit to what you see as some of the intersectionality, and then what you see as some of the particularities for the systemic, horrific cultural genocide of the Coast Salish peoples that we have perpetrated here in this region.
I'm going to have you clarify that second question in a minute after I answer your first question.
Okay.
But that first question about the differences and the similarities, and Sharon asked a question about the Indian Act, which is particular to Canada, but there are similar policies in the States about what makes you Indigenous, and so just trying to think of where first I encountered this, and I'm not going to be able to pull that up, but the concept that basically one drop of Black blood makes you Black advantages the system that needs Black labor to be free in order to, not to be free, to have free access to the labor of Black people. And so the ways in which Blackness is defined is you got any of it, and that makes you Black. Around Indigenous peoples, the project has always been one of assimilation, that the policies both in Canada and the US, be that the Indian Act or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, have always said, if you have any white blood in you, that makes you absorbed into the body politic. And forever, the state wants to make Indigenous peoples part of dominant culture and to remove their indigeneity. Indigenous peoples have their own ways of determining who is part of their family or not. And there have been lots of battles over the years about whether there's a blood quantum, a percentage of your blood that needs to be Indigenous for you to be recognized as Indigenous. But the ways that those two things operate are: one, with Indigenous peoples, as easily as possible, we want to remove them from any claims to the land. Two, for Black people, you want to be able to retain their labor. And so those, what makes you Black or Indigenous goes in kind of opposite directions in that way as it functions for the privilege of whiteness and white superiority. The other piece that's true in both of those scenarios is that it is white supremacy that is the benefiting body. And so the work of understanding and dismantling white supremacy is key for the liberation both of Black and Indigenous bodies, right? Yeah, both are exploited. So identifying that, and it's really encouraging to me that in the last 5 years, I wish it was longer, but that we are starting to talk about whiteness and white superiority and starting to recognize that white supremacy isn't just KKK, burning crosses kinds of acts. That is some very mundane, very basic privilege that can be attributed to white supremacy, and understanding that and unpacking that being important work for white folks to be doing that advantages both. So now, Sheris, I'm going to give you the opportunity to clarify that second question if you want to, or we can go somewhere else.
What are some of the particularities of relationship with our Indigenous siblings in anti-racism that may be different than the work within, for instance, a Black Lives Matter movement, if that helps?
Right. And that's going to be particular to your space and the leadership that's present in your community particularly. But so some of the dynamics that I have encountered in my context and some others around that include Indigenous folks having this understanding of being, and the strong value that we are all one, we are all relations with one another. And while there is need to follow Indigenous leadership and to listen to Indigenous voices, there is the strong value of doing so together. There are good and legitimate reasons why in movements like Black Lives Matter, there has been a move for Black only organizing and Black folks speaking to the dynamics. It sometimes means as a white ally to step totally out of that and to be, to not be involved. There is some resonance between both communities around how whiteness changes the dynamic, and it is a great loss for me that that neither Cheryl nor my friend Diane were able to be on this call with me, because it is important that we do this work at least in the in communication with and in the presence of the people most affected. And so I did get permission to be on this call from the elders who I check in with, and who I will then debrief this call with as well. So those are important. It's important that we not do these things in isolation. And as much as possible, I do try to tell, and this is important in both of these stories. So I try to tell my stories and tell the story of from a settler perspective. So the incarceration rates, that's the system that benefits me, but naming it as an incarceration rate rather than naming it as describing an Indigenous problem, for example. I'm not perfect at that, and feel free to call me out when I misstep on that at any point in time. But those are important things to figure out how we speak to our perspectives and our place, rather than speaking for or about other people's perspective or place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. And the importance, the absolute necessity to listen to Indigenous voices, which is the same as listening to voices of color here in the U.S. Would you have some specific resources for us to go to? My reading list for anti-racism in the U.S. In relation to our Black siblings is growing. The list of resources in that regard for Indigenous voices is really small. Do you have some suggestions, both in things that we can go to without, that we can go to on our own, and then other ways in which we can listen to Indigenous voices other than reading or movies or things like that? Do you have suggestions for resources for us, or how to go about things?
Yeah, and I can send, I got lots of resources, but I can call through and separate out what might be US versus Canadian specific resources, and I'm would be happy to do that. It's also important to note that in the States, the civil rights movement divided early on and did not include what was the AIM movement, the American Indian movement, at that point in time, and that many of the those stories and those journeys have kind of departed from one another in how they've played out. There is a movement among the NAACP these days to join those narratives more, and so those are important spaces to listen to as well. But yes, I will get you some resources for sure.
That'd be great, and we'll post that on the Echoes Facebook page, probably in this event as well, and then also on the Echoes website. You can do that. That'd be great. Thank you.
And always prioritizing Indigenous voices over non-Indigenous voices that speak about Indigenous voices.
Correct.
That's always an important value.
Do you have other suggestions for listening to Indigenous voices other than what's in print or in media?
Yeah, showing up to events, knowing that I have yet to, no, that's not true. There are some ceremonies that are not, especially on the coast, that are not open to everybody. But if you hear about a gathering, and the Lummi have a number of gatherings in the summer, I believe, or a powwow or anything like that, you're welcome to be there in those spaces. And so show up. One word I would say though is, as in white culture, we show value by asking lots of questions. And in many Indigenous cultures, especially Coast Salish cultures, there's a higher value in watching and learning. So it's really interesting for me to watch some kids who I hang out with get taught how to drum. And it was done in a totally different way from how I would do it. I would give lots of instructions. I would encourage them to be asking questions to clarify what was going on. There were no words exchanged in this experience, but the drum itself, a big powwow drum with 8 big guys wailing on this drum, it doesn't take any words. If you hit that drum on the offbeat, your whole hand is vibrating and you're learning how to pay attention and read the nuances of what's going on. And my experience has been that that's a showing up and listening and waiting for, just knowing that you don't have to be explicitly included to be included, but stay as long as you can, and just be there would be my big advice. When I first started pastoring God's House of Many Faces, which was the mostly Indigenous church plant, I realized that I needed to let go of my white ways of learning a new context, which had to do with a lot of books and a lot of reading and a lot of gathering of information. And I needed to just be with people, and that served me well. I didn't realize that. It was told me, and it was good advice.
Well, thank you for passing that along to us as well. So there is a huge need to do something, you know, like to try and have some role in fixing all that's gone so poorly because of what's happened, both from our ancestors' perspective and in the systems in which we are still caught up in. And we got to change it somehow now, because it's, yeah. And so the just being and sitting in is really, really important. So, well, I'd love to open it up to some questions. And we've had a few on here on the chat, and I think we've addressed some of those. Have you heard anything about this? Charles asked the question, the 60s scoop. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, so that is particular to Canada. It was one of the follow-ups from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that there was also a class action lawsuit around those from the 1960s through the 90s who were not only taken into foster care, but that there were some very deliberate movements to take children right out of hospital, and in some cases send them as far away as Germany, feeling that it was better for them to be raised in non-Indigenous homes. That is, it is its own legal process and is in the stages of settlement as we speak. There was a movement like this in the US as well. So maybe leave it at that. It's okay. Related to foster care.
Okay. Thanks, Jodi. I do want to say that you are welcome to unmute yourself to ask a question. We are recording this. And as such, your name and possibly your face, if you've got your video going, will be in the recording. So if you would rather just go a little bit more anonymous than that, you're welcome to change the name of yourself, and turn your video off if you'd like. But I do want to give just a heads up that we are recording this, and we do hope to be able to post this online at a later time. And just know that for if you're asking a question by audio, you're also welcome to ask a question in the chat. We did have one question from Tim in the chat. I don't, if you know this, Tim asks if the church is more involved in things like foster care and residential schools in Canada versus churches being involved in things like that here in the US.
Yeah, so the quick answer to that is that because of the difference in the separation of church and state in the US from Canada, there wasn't that same separation of church and state. So the legal action of both the state in Canada saying, hey, churches, you run the residential schools, and then their responsibility, church's responsibility in that is different from in the US. So there were mission schools and continue to be mission schools of a variety of sorts in the US. And those, many of those are run by churches, or were run by churches, but it wasn't the same government mandate for that action. So in terms of foster care is a matter of individuals as opposed to churches as bodies, whereas it was churches who financially benefited from running residential schools in Canada. So foster care also in the States, it is largely Christian families who do offer foster care, and so your numbers would be quite similar in those ways.
Thank you.
The question two, in the truth and reconciliation process, one of the curiosities I had was, has there been conflict among the different First Nations people about what reconciliation is or what that should look like? Because I can imagine that each, sovereign nation might have its own wants, desires, concepts of what that should look like. And so I was curious of maybe if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so some folks here really don't like the language of reconciliation, because they would say that you can't, reconciliation assumes that you're coming back to some good relationship, and perhaps there was never a good relationship to return to. So they would prefer the language of conciliation, and for very good reasons. That there were also very different opinions about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in some ways, and whether or not reopening trauma for folks was worth it. So if you reopen that trauma, but no one, but again, the effects of that are borne on those who had been victimized rather than change in the system. That is a tough one to weigh. And I have friends who died by overdose with their settlement money, and that's real too, right?
Any other questions? I have a feeling we have a lot of questions. It's whether or not we want to ask them.
That with that last, some of this has been a bit of a downer. So I would like Jodi to speak to what she is hopeful of and looking forward to as next steps.
Oh, thanks for that. The other disadvantage of not having an Indigenous person with me is that we would have laughed a lot more if any of my friends had been on this call, and they would have reminded us and brought the reality that humor keeps us all going in the midst of it. And so that's an important piece. The realities are heavy and they're grim in many respects. But I might actually just pick up this reconciliation concept, that we do this work, I do this work, we do any of this decolonizing, dismantling of white supremacy work. We do it because it matters that our humanity is bound up with one another. And that as people of faith, we believe that if any part of the body is hurting, that we all hurt. And we have too often chosen to only pay attention to the parts that aren't hurting. And we're diminished because of it. And the hope actually is the power and the beauty when the body is whole and when all of its parts are rightly ordered and honored. There is something much more dynamic and that feels much more like the kingdom of God and much more like new life of gospel than what we've often settled for. And so while there might not be a point of conciliation that we're referring back to in our lived memory, in the imagination of God, we are working towards reconciliation because we are trying to come back to the space that God intended in the first place and that exists fully in the imagination of God even now, and for which Jesus gave his life, that we can enter in, not from success story to success story, but actually through that path of the cross, which is why I think it's important that we walk these kind of really uncomfortable and really, really heavy parts of the journey, because that's the only path I know of that leads us into true reconciliation and true resurrection, because that is meant to be that path. So you got me a little preacherly at the end there, but
it's preaching that we don't hear enough, honestly. So even if folks don't have a perspective of faith, that type of preaching is helpful, and it's not out there enough. So thank you. Any other questions?
Hey, Sheris, this is Tim.
Hey, Tim.
For the record, Tim Surratt, Echoes member. Since I can't see everybody on the call, I just like to tell folks that this is a little bit in a hiatus right now because of the COVID pandemic. But for the last couple of years, Bruna Press, B-R-U-N-A, Press, P-R-E-S-S, you can Google that, here on Prospect Street in Bellingham, on the Sunday nearest the full moon, has a gathering with Bill John, a Lummi elder. And if you would like to come and listen and watch and learn just a little bit of Lummi language and hear what each moon is about, the opportunity is there. And I'm sure that we will be back together sometime in the future. So kind of think about that. You can look at your calendar and you can see when the Sunday nearest the new moon is, or the full moon is, and come on out.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim, for offering that opportunity for listening. So Michael asks, in light of your experience, Jodi, with indigenous wisdom, how has your understanding of the biblical narrative been changed? It's a great question.
Asking a question of a long period of time in ways I probably can't entirely untangle. Well, I'll tell you one story. So when I was, so the church that we planted came into existence at the invitation of some folks in an underserved neighborhood who invited us to come and start church. They wanted to do church in their neighborhood. And very quickly that church was included more people who were Indigenous than who were non. And so I invoked a mentor, and that mentor asked me one week, why do white people not believe in the Bible? I said, tell me more, because I had learned at that point that I needed to ask a question instead of tell him why I did. And he said, all the white people I know who preach, you open up your book and you talk about the things that are in there, and you close it and you put it on the shelf, and it has nothing to do with the way that you live your life. He said, but for me, the stories that have the greatest impact in my life, they live in my belly. They live here in me. And they have the ability to go with me and to inform me in everything I do and in all of the ways that I live and interact in the world. And he said, so why do white people not believe the Bible in their gut? Why do they leave it in the book? Which was a beautiful challenge. I've spent thousands of dollars and decades and decades of years studying the biblical text, but to close that text and to live it and to teach it from my gut instead of from the book or from up here is perhaps one of the more important parts of that journey for me. It's not a difference in the story, but it's a difference in the ways in which we live into that story and offer it to one another.
Well, Jodi, if people wanted to get a hold of you, how would they do that?
Jodi at redclover.ca, redclover.ca. Red clover is one of the few plants that can remove toxins from the soil and make soil productive again. And so that is redclover.ca is also the website for the work that I do. And that's how you can get hold of me, Jodi at redclover.ca.
Great, thank you. And Jodi, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I am glad that we have been able to record this. Presumably the recording will come out okay so that we can post it and have other folks be able to watch it. We had a few requests to be able to see it because they couldn't be here tonight. And some of our actually classmates as well from seminary were interested in being able to watch. So there was much tonight to lament, there's much tonight to learn from, and there's much tonight to move towards. And I'm so grateful for your presence, who you are, what you're doing. And maybe we'll have a chance to have you on again, and possibly with Cheryl Bear, since Cheryl also was a classmate of ours too. Yeah, if you have questions for Jodi that you'd like to follow up, please feel free to get a hold of her. She's unbelievably busy right now, so it may take a little while to get back, but I'm sure she'd welcome any further questions. Echoes, again, typically meets on Monday nights. You're welcome to find out who we are through our website, through getting on our email about what we're doing. We do different things on Monday nights, and it's been primarily virtual. in these days. July might be opening up a little bit, but we'll see. So I would like to offer a blessing to everyone tonight, and I'd actually like to ask if Jodi could offer us a blessing. So maybe I could switch it back over to you, because this is a unique opportunity. If people get to hear from me, but we don't get to hear much from you. Could you end us with a blessing tonight?
Sure. It would be an honor.
Thank you.
Friends, may you find in discomfort the comfort of one who longs for wholeness. May you find the courage to offer your vulnerability in ways that might build bridges and create trust and equity. May you be ready in these days where we are apart to move towards one another with greater generosity, with greater curiosity, and with greater courage. Because we are all related and held in the mind and the imagination of the one who sees us whole. Thank you for the chance to be together. Blessings all.
Amen. Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone. Good night.